hope you'll enjoy that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Analysis of alternatives in socioeconomic analysis, well, quite broad subjects. I'm sure that you've already experienced that. So I have very little time for these topics, about 25 minutes. So I have set myself very modest objectives for this presentation to I thought that perhaps would be useful for you to understand what the reasons for including an analysis of alternatives in assessment of a socioeconomic impact in the applications are. As we have very detailed guidances, I thought that if you understand the reasons, you would be able to judge what parts of this analysis are more important from your perspective, from the perspective of your needs to demonstrate your case. So from that standpoint, I'm not going to talk about steps in analysis of alternatives or how you can summarize your conclusions. For that, we have very detailed guidance documents, but I will describe what these two analyses entail, perhaps dispel some of common misconceptions and perhaps fears that these two analyses are quite complex. I will touch upon some of the key concepts. And I will tell you where you can find more information about how to summarize your results and conduct these analyses. I haven't done this presentation in quite some time, so I must recognize a former colleague of mine, Richard de Bourg. I've used, of course I can't give exactly the same presentation as he did, but I have used some of his slides, so I should give him the credit where the credit is, as I have borrowed some of his slides. So without further ado, why the regulators are asking for analysis of alternatives and socioeconomic impacts? Well, the short story is to help them decide whether an authorization is a sound regulatory decision. And when is a decision sound? Well, when the positives outweigh the negatives. And from that perspective, the regulators are asking you asking to understand what would be the cost and benefits for the primary affected actors. Those are, of course, the applicants and perhaps their immediate supply chain. And they're also asking to understand what will be the cost and benefits for society as a whole. Of course, these costs and benefits need to be assessed from the perspective of the REACH authorization goals. And what are those? There are two. You've already probably heard in the first session today that one of the main goals of the authorization title in REACH is to assure that the risks from substances of very high concern are properly controlled. I'm not going to talk about this. Many of you are familiar how to do this with the chemical safety assessment and how to summarize this in the CSR. We're talking about analysis of alternatives and SEA, so I will speak more about the second equally important objective that was put forward by the authorization title. This is to progressively replace these substances with less dangerous substances where these are technically and economically feasible. So from that perspective, the regulator is asking companies to analyze the alternatives to continue use, to report on their ongoing and planned R&D, to periodically subject themselves to monitoring and review, and to apply for an authorization if no alternative is available to the continued use of the Annex 14 substance, or at least the costs of transitioning to this alternative are these costs are much greater than the cost for applying for authorization. Of course, there is your own decision-making scenario. If it costs more to apply for authorization, why apply? Just transition. Before we talk about the role of analyzing alternatives and socioeconomic analysis, I need to remind you that there are two ways under which the regulators could grant an authorization. This is, of course, the adequate control. You're already familiar with it. I heard that you asked some specific questions about it. You know that under the adequate control route, the fact that you show adequate control in your CSR is sufficient to grant an authorization, but the importance of the analysis of alternatives there is that you show how long it will take to transition to a suitable alternative, and that has a direct impact on the review period for which the authorization is granted. The analysis of alternatives could also provide supporting information for the review period and for any conditions that could be imposed as part of your authorization. Under the socioeconomic route, the importance of analysis of alternatives is even greater because the regulators are not allowed to grant an authorization if there is suitable alternatives. In addition, again, although although SEA is not required under REACH, it is essential in practice as an authorization can be granted only if the benefits outweigh the risks, and this could be determined only by the examination of the socioeconomic impacts of the world with or without an authorization. So what is the role of the analysis of alternatives and of socioeconomic analysis in an application for authorization? Well, in very brief terms, when you are analyzing the alternatives, you're doing it in order to understand whether there is an alternative substance or technology to replace your Annex 14 substance. Usually this is more an introspective analysis. It's from the perspective of the applicant or its immediate supply chain, in particularly when the applicant is the manufacturer or the importer, as the substance is used down the supply chain. And when to help you understand whether there is alternatives or not, and what is the impact for your business as a result of the existence of these, availability of these suitable alternatives. You can ask yourself a number of questions. What you can do if you can no longer use this substance, what are the likely alternatives you can switch to, how long it will take, what actions you must take, and basically the result of this analysis helps you formulate a world, a fictitious scenario perhaps, of a situation where you no longer are able to use the substance. And that is the basis for the socioeconomic analysis, where you need to compare this world where you no longer can use the substance with perhaps the status quo of when you can use the substance. And by comparing these two scenarios, you're able to understand what would be the impacts to society now, not only for you and your immediate supply chain, but to society as a whole, of the authorization decision, with the objective to show that the benefits of an authorization exceed the risks. So if we are to take this in more detail, in more detailed steps, how do you build this scenario of when the substance is no longer available for you? What the regulation is asking the regulator is asking you for some key elements, and those are to look as the alternative first as an alternative substance or technology to the Annex 14 substance in terms of replacing or substituting the function of the Annex 14 substance. So from that perspective, you cast a wide net and you look at the results of your own R&D or the results of the R&D from the industry in order to come up with a list of possible alternatives. You describe the efforts of of identifying these possible alternatives. You also look at come up with a defined criteria of that the alternative substance must meet in order for the function to be performed. And then you shortlist a number of alternatives that perhaps are good candidates for substitution, and you assess them as per the regulation in terms of their feasibility, reduction of risk, and availability. The outcome of this analysis for each of the alternatives is whether the alternative is suitable and available, and in this case you need to create to prepare a substitution plan, and if not, what will it take to make it suitable and available. And these actions will hopefully help you conclude whether an alternative course of action for you is to transition to an alternative, or there exists a different course of action in the event the Annex 14 substance is no longer available for you. These could be, for example, a relocation outside of the European Union, the importation of the substance already incorporated in an article, or a shutdown. The most likely of these actions will formulate the non-use scenario, which will be the basis for your socioeconomic analysis, where you can compare these two worlds, with and without you using the substance. But when you do that, this is no longer an introspective analysis. It is an analysis from the society's perspective. And you need to keep in mind that the differences between the applied for use scenario and the non-use scenario could be grouped in a number of different impacts. Those are of course, the technical, the feasibility and the availability will give rise to an economic impact, and the reduction in overall risk will give rise to human health and environmental impacts. So is there a methodology for analyzing alternatives? Yes, we have described it in our guidance documents, and there is available templates that describe it in great detail. However, what you need to keep in mind that it depends on the applicant's case, and you need to select what aspects of the analysis you need to go into greater detail, and where in order to keep the analysis real and grounded on your case. You need to keep in mind the substitution is the long-term goal of REACH, and the authorization is not guaranteed, and you need to think about what will be the situation if the substance is no longer available for you. It is very much similar to any other any other analysis that you prepare for an investment decision. The added elements here, of course, are that as part of the authorization process, we run a public consultation, which often we have competitors that provide input, so we do take into account some information that they may provide on available alternatives. And if, for example, these alternatives are not addressed in your analysis, the committees will be likely asking for your justification of why you haven't considered them, and significant omissions may impact your review period, as the time to transition to the alternatives is a key determining factor of the review period. Of course, when you are picking and choosing what elements you need to focus on in your analysis, you must keep in mind that there is what is needed from regulators' point of view. Of course, if you want your application, if you're arguing for an authorization under the socioeconomic route, then of course you must keep in mind that it is needed to show that there is no suitable alternative as of the sunset date. A number of other key Elements need to be discussed, such as technical and economic feasibility, reduction in risk, and also availability. All these 4 criteria are basically they have to be met in order to conclude that an alternative is suitable and available at the time of the sunset date. In the interest of time, I think technical feasibility is quite a recognized concept, and I think it doesn't need further clarification, but perhaps economic feasibility and availability require a little bit more of an explanation. I have to say that the committees have published documents that explain how these 2 concepts will be judged as part of the authorization application, and in particular to ensure equal treatment of applicants. For economic feasibility, the focus is on the change in the applicant's net costs. So you can see the, I think it's Annex I in our SEA guidance that details how compliance costs are calculated. In principle, as part of the an analysis of alternatives, you're asked to describe what you will do if this alternative substance is technology is the only course of action for you. If the Annex 14 substance is not available, most likely you will incur costs, and you're asked to describe these costs. No specific threshold is set to distinguish between feasible and unfeasible, so the focus of the committees is to scrutinize the costs and assumptions that you have provided with the view of ensuring appropriate estimation to avoid overestimation. It's important to keep in mind that feasibility might be sensitive to the investment time horizons, and there's 2 key dates here. Of course, the first one is very objective. It's specified in Annex 14. That's the sunset date. The second one is very specific to the applicant's case. This is the date at which the transition to alternative, perhaps down the road, perhaps will be possible as a result of R&D or as a result of the end of the investment cycle, which will make the transition to an alternative a more business suitable decision. The public consultation in the assessment of the economic feasibility, the public consultation will be used to ensure that all alternatives are identified. Sometimes we ask follow-up questions in order to those who have submitted comments in order to verify your analysis. As I said, SEAC will challenge applicants to explain why identified alternatives are not feasible to them, or, for example, to justify why certain costs are included in the analysis. What is meant by availability in the context of REACH? Those are substances or technologies that are reasonable, accessible without undue delay. They're available in the required quantity. They're developed enough to allow interpretation and to fulfill the relevant quality of legal requirements. This is again done at a particular point of time, and that point of time is the sunset date. So I spent some time on telling you about the methodology and the important concepts under analyzing alternatives. What about assessment of socioeconomic impacts? Again, is there a methodology? According to our guidance document, yes, it is, but I have to say that again, that it is very detailed. It is meant to be comprehensive and encompassing of all possible cases. So from this perspective, the applicants are not required to address every single aspect of the socioeconomic impact methodology put forward in the guidance document, but to look at it and on the basis of that methodology understand what are the material impacts important for justification of their case. It is, in essence, a comparison between the world and with and without an authorization, or the use and the non-use scenario. It is, of course, done with the objective to answer the question, do benefits exceed the risks? And the risks in this particular case are the environmental and health risks associated with the continued use of the substance. The costs the benefits of the authorization are the avoided costs of switching the alternative, and those could relate to direct and indirect costs of related to the transitioning to the alternative, or perhaps of relocation, such as economic impacts as employment or local economic performance. The costs, those could also involve the cost of shutdown. Those are profits and value added in the supply chain. What costs are material for your case perhaps could be determined with an outside help. Sometimes it's good to just get an external perspective in order to help you determine where you should focus more your efforts. A laundry list is not always very useful. At the end of the day, you will see, if you look at some of the opinions, you will see that in the presence of a very long list of impacts, the committees have based their opinion on the main impacts that are well justified and quite intuitive to the case. Often we're asked how deep to go in the analysis. And of course, that is often linked to how many of the impacts to quantify and monetize. Quantification and monetization can be very difficult, and of course, when you don't have dose response relationship or monetary values to help you quantify and monetize the impact, the risks, then this is extremely difficult. It requires quite a lot of analytical effort. ECHA has been helping recently, and you had a discussion on the DNLs and the dose-response relationships earlier. I suppose from my perspective, or based on my observations, when it is easier to show your case when all impacts are in the same unit. So I would perhaps encourage you, if those are available, if the dose response relationships are available and the monetary values, then I would encourage you to use them. Of course, you could always, as mentioned previously, you could always do your own. What I could add to the previous discussion is that the reason why the committees have gone into establishing those is also to ensure equal treatment to applicants. Sometimes the use of a different dose-response relationship or monetary values could swing the outcome of the analysis in one direction or another. When those are not available, it is our guidance document. I've included a quote here. Our guidance document states that it is up to the applicant to determine how far you wish to go, and from my perspective, it is up to you to show, it is up to your case. If it is easier for you to show without quantification and monetization that the benefits outweigh the risks, then perhaps further, the benefit of going further and quantifying and monetizing would be marginal. Again, perhaps outside experts could help, especially with the dose-response relationship and the monitoring values for some of the health or environmental outcomes, but of course beware of supply-induced demand. Another way to look at, to determine how far you want to go into the analysis is to, of course, look at what you want to accomplish and what your case could support. In these, in the new templates, we're also asking you to specify what would be the review period, what the review period you're applying for. This is not an isolated number. It should be supported with your application, with all aspects of your application. And here I've included, there is a paper by the committees on how the review period is determined. Here I've included the list of criteria that are taken into account for a long review period. So you can see that those, when you have when the socioeconomic benefits significantly outweigh the risks, when alternatives will not be available within the review period, or the cost of transitioning to alternatives are very high, or the investment cycle is demonstratively long. It's not, so of course, if the more of these criteria you can demonstrate that are supported by your case, then the higher the likelihood of a longer review period. Of course, the SEC in the determination of the review period also takes any recommendations of RAC on the basis of the strength of your risk assessment. And here I've just mentioned that all the guidance documents and our templates for summarizing the results of your analysis of alternatives in ECHA are available on our website. It was recently redesigned, and that's the work of my colleague Sanna Hendrickson. To show that the interlinkages between the socioeconomic analysis and analysis of alternatives, that in fact analysis of alternatives feeds into the assessment of impacts, we have now prepared a joint analysis of alternatives and ECHA template. But if you have already begun to use the individual templates, those are still available on our website, and my understanding is that we will be accepting them. And if I still have I have only 1 minute, then in this case I will not focus on what I have noticed as some of the main deficiencies of the applications, based of course on my experience to date. But if you are interested, I can tell you more during the question and answer period. Now I just hope that I have left you with the impression that analyzing alternatives will help you identify what will happen if an authorization is not granted, and analyzing socioeconomic impacts will help you assess whether an authorization is a good decision for society or not. The methodology should be grounded on your case, and you should focus on highlighting and really elaborating on impacts that are material for your case. The way you present your results should allow for scrutiny. That is the job of the committees, to assess how grounded and well justified your analysis is. Please do look at our guidance documents. Yes, they are quite long and sometimes confusing, but they do offer, in particular, the compliance cost guidance would be quite beneficial for you. I hope that this, by focusing on the main drivers to demonstrate your case, you will be able to prepare an assessment of socioeconomic impacts that is not that complex and could be well communicated. Thank you.